Look at these astonishing before and after photos of rapidly retreating glaciers atop Africa's highest mountains. What on earth is causing this rapid melting?
Now, the roof of Africa used to be covered in ice, really covered. And now there's these lonely little ice cubes out there in the middle of the desert.
Scientists are now just piecing together the scary reality. Here is a quote from one of the research publications on the subject. Linear extrapolation of the retreat in each of the 3 identified glacier assemblages implies the ice cover on the western slopes of Kilimanjaro will be gone before 2020, while the remaining ice bodies on the plateau and southern slopes will be likely disappear by 2040. It is highly unlikely that any body of ice will be present on Kilimanjaro after 2060 if the present day climatological conditions are maintained. What if I told you that we are the last generation to ever see snow at the equator in Africa? After millions of years, we might be the last African population to ever enjoy the life-giving waters that flow from these majestic mountains at the roof of the African continent. Welcome, this is the African Scientist. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, African mountain glaciers are melting so quickly that they are likely to disappear in the next 2 decades. Snow-capped mountains like Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, and Mt Ruwenzori that have been the source of life-sustaining flows of water and a source of beauty for the entire East African region are now under threat because of the melting of glaciers that have lasted for eons, threatening over 100 million people with drought, famine, insecurity, and displacement from their homes. Yes, time for some not so good news. Will Gard, a world-renowned adventurer and ice climber, was forced to abandon his ascent to the glaciers atop Mount Kilimanjaro after he discovered that the ascent was no longer possible due to shrinking ice glaciers that are now only a fraction of what they used to be. In fact, Gard said that the melting of the glaciers atop Mount Kilimanjaro are just a fraction of the changes that he has witnessed in his career of glaciers melting all around the globe. And guess what is causing all this? Our favorite buzzword here, climate change. Mount Kilimanjaro has lost so much ice that it is now impossible for ice climbers to carry out their expeditions atop this mountain. This really puts into perspective just how sensitive the glaciers in the tropics are to the changes that are happening to the atmosphere on Earth. The World Meteorological Organization Secretary General Peter Talas has said that the melting of the last remaining glaciers atop African mountains signal a threat of imminent and irreversible change upon the Earth's systems. In the 19th century, glaciers formed a rugged fringe along one of the calderas atop Mount Kilimanjaro by the name the Kibo caldera. But today, about 90% of the ice that once existed on this caldera has been lost to evaporation and sublimation. Douglas Hardy, a glacier and climate specialist at the University of Massachusetts, has said that most of the glacier will disappear in just a few years, and at most, the last ice on top of Mount Kilimanjaro will melt in just a few decades. Their research has shown that the snow cover atop Mount Kilimanjaro is more sensitive to cloud cover, humidity, and even small changes in air temperature. Their findings have shown that global warming has changed the weather patterns atop Mount Kilimanjaro, causing the rapid heating of the region and the rapid melting and disappearance of the glaciers that once crowned the roof of Africa. Glaciers are usually protected by the albedo effect, where incoming solar radiation is mostly reflected by their white brilliance. But as more snow is melting, more of the ground is being exposed. The darker color of the ground is absorbing more solar radiation, meaning that more heat will get trapped into the system. So as more snow melts, the rate of melting just keeps increasing, getting faster and faster with each passing season. Just between 2014 and 2020, the GPS research has shown that the glacier has lost about 70% of the mass that it once had. From the huge jagged ridges that once existed, only thin walls of glaciers now remain. From Mount Kenya, the snow-capped snow-capped mountains were the source of folklore, tales of bravery and bounty handed down from generation to generation. From the peaks that rise almost to 5,000 meters above sea level, flowed rivers that gave life to the farmers that lived downstream. But as the rate of glacial melt has been increasing, more and more rivers are drying out. Farmers can no longer find the pastures that their cattle once used to enjoy. And this is causing conflicts among the communities that live at the foot of the mountain. As the glaciers melt, rivers flood and burst their banks. However, because of increased atmospheric temperatures, the glaciers are unable to recover, meaning that year after year, the volume of the water flowing down the mountain keeps reducing. For a country as reliant on agriculture as Kenya is, a reduction in rainfall and water flow down its mountains truly marks a danger to the livelihood of the people who depend on the mountain for their sustenance. In Central Africa exists the beautiful Ruwenzori Mountains, once thought to be the source of the Nile. The name of the mountain comes from the Bakonzo language, from the word Ruwenzori, which means the place of snow. The irony is that the snow atop the mountain has shrunk from 6.5 square kilometers in 1906 to just 1 square kilometer in 2003. And researchers predict that the snow atop Mt Ruwenzori could completely disappear by the end of this decade. In fact, in 2012, wild forest fires atop the mountain reached as high as 4,000 meters above sea level, perhaps underscoring just how serious the problem is as the glaciers melt. The fire destroyed the vegetation that used to slow down the flow of water down the mountain, only exacerbating the problem that is getting worse by the day. In fact, since the beginning of this decade, the people living at the foot of the Ruwenzori Mountains have suffered the most destructive floods as rivers burst their banks due to the melting glaciers, and the rainfall patterns changing to less frequent but heavier rainfall each season. The farmers that used to rely on the rainfall for subsistence now don't have even enough to feed their families due to droughts and floods. The problem of climate change and the consequences that occur due to rising temperatures always sounds abstract until you realize and hear about the true human cost and the consequences that generations will face, not just today but many years to come. The UNEP climate report has underscored that the problem of melting glaciers is actually worse than scientists had first predicted. By the year 2040, Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Ruwenzori are expected to be completely bare of any ice in all seasons, with Mount Kenya being the first mountain ever to completely lose its glacial capped peaks completely due to human-induced climate change. Even though Africa only produces 4% of the greenhouse emissions, the continent is among the most vulnerable to the changes that are taking place due to climate change. I made a whole video about the effects of climate change to the cities and the populations of Africa. If you'd like to see more of that, please click on the pop-up banner. By 2030, up to 118 million vulnerable people in Africa will be exposed to drought, floods, and extreme heat if no changes to our global carbon emissions take place. Sadly, the effects of climate change are expected to cause a reduction of up to 3% in the GDP of the African continent by the end of 2050. Because Africa is warming up faster than many parts of the world, some countries are already feeling the pinch. For example, the East African island country of Madagascar has recently faced the worst drought on record, forcing thousands to flee their homes looking for greener pastures as most of the country is stricken with famine. An area of the world that has contributed perhaps the least to climate change is now paying the highest price. In a span of just 2 weeks, 2 deadly cyclones have hit Madagascar, with one, Cyclone Anna, killing 55 people, and Cyclone Batsirai making landfall as I edit this video. Climate change is real, y'all. Perhaps it's now time for you to consider your hike to the top of Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, or Mount Ruwenzori. Go see those ice caps because they won't be here in just a few years. If you like what we do here, the African Scientists, please consider subscribing to this channel. And also please like the video so that YouTube can show it to more people. The conversation does not end here. We now have a podcast, the African Scientist Podcast, where African voices speak science. Click on the link in the description to find out more. This is the African Scientist, science from an African perspective. YouTube thinks you may like this video. Click on it to find out.